The fog came in fast, swallowing the harbor lights until Bar Harbor looked erased and redrawn in chalk. Jack Rourke stood by the payphone at the end of the boardwalk, collar up against the wet, counting horn blasts and months. 3, if he let life go as planned. The handset was slick where someone had held it too long, the cord still trembling like it remembered the last hands. 5 years sat behind his ribs, where an old case never healed, a tide that never turned. Dispatch had said, "Missing," but the air already had that stillness it kept for worse words. Somewhere beyond the blank, a bellboy tolled and a gull laughed, as if it knew the punchline. He picked up the phone and dialed the number that could tell him who stood here last and why they left without saying goodbye. The dial tone steadied. Habit, not hope, kept his grip firm. He wiped his thumb across the damp metal and noted the smear of oil the rain hadn't lifted. Pocketed the detail. The boards under his shoes flexed a little, old wood soft with salt. Behind him a cruiser idled. The radio low analog chatter and code he could translate half asleep. He didn't need the radio to know the shape of the night. It looked like a mother waiting too long, a lamp left on, a gap in a routine so precise you could measure it against a tide chart. Seaside Pines Motel kept its neon honest. Open, flickered with more optimism than the lobby deserved. Claire Lund had the look of someone who'd been holding her breath since the phone rang. "Room 12, she said, keys already on the counter. "Emily Hart." She didn't. She never misses the morning shift. Room 12 held the order of a person who intended to return. A lined notebook under the mattress, a VCR blinking 12 ogo, a VHS of weather reports warm from the slot, a fold of map marked with bus routes and park trails. On the dresser, a receipt from the Narrows, time-stamped 11:17 p.m., coffee and blueberry pie. In the trash, a matchbook, salt-warped, stamped WINDWARD in blue ink. The bed was made with care that said someone tried to leave without leaving a mess. He walked the path from motel to diner in his head, then in his feet. Fog ate the street lamps whole, turned distances into guesses. The Narrows had the kind of light that made the night feel like a story you could still rewrite. Marla, the night waitress, remembered the pie, the neat girl with the quiet voice, and a man in a navy peacoat at the corner table who didn't touch his coffee. He kept looking at the payphone, she said, like he was waiting for it to ring, and ring for him only. The payphone by the door had a chrome cradle polished by the same dozen hands all winter. New prints have a way of looking clean. He wrote down the number and the way the coin slot stuck, swallowed, then gave details that matter when nothing else wants to. The harbor master's office smelled like diesel and paper, like it remembered when men wrote things that stayed written. Hal Crowley wore his rotary pin and a winter that had gone long. "You're late to the party," he said, not unkindly. "Season's over. Ghosts left with the tourists." Emily Hart didn't, Jack said. He let his hand rest on the ledger like it was an old friend. "Windward tours closed up?" "Last month," Hal said. "Insurance says no after October. Keys to spare are in my desk. You know the rules." Rules were a part of his job. The ways men worked around them were the rest. Outside, Slip 7 had the look of a bed smoothed too fast. Fresh scuffs near the cleat, a smear with a rainbow sheen under a weak sun. He crouched, took a swab, marked it, gave it the dignity of a chain of custody in a town where some judges still preferred a firm handshake. Eli Morin, hands like net floats, watched from a few slips down. "Tide's wrong for joyrides," he said. "You try to squeeze the sound on a night like this, you scrape her belly clean." "Unless you know the windows," Jack said. Eli shrugged, the movement small and certain. "There are always windows, narrower than men think." At home, warm light pooled on the kitchen table, and the house was a map of what he could still lose. Susan didn't ask the wrong questions, which is the whole art of marriage when you're married to a job. He sat with the old file before he slept shallow. Timothy Lafferty, 28. Deckhand. 5 Novembers ago. Late shift. Phone call no one could source fast enough because in 1990 the phone company's answers lived 2 towns over. The same bell buoy, the same fog, the same place in his chest that refused to close. Morning peeled a thin sheet off the fog and pretended to lift it. Ranger Peter Sadowski met him at the park's edge with a scrap of navy fabric damp against his glove. "Found this near Otter Point," Peter said. Could be nothing. It could be everything, which often meant it was something different. "We tell them not to walk alone at night," Peter added. "Seasonal staff think the ocean is a postcard until it asks for change." Back at the station, the fax machine coughed out a page with the stubbornness of old tech. Phone records on the payphone near the Narrows, an 11:22 p.m. call to the harbor office number, rolled to the answering machine. He pressed play. A breathy voice, masked by effort, said 6 digits. 717, same as last time. The tape clicked. He didn't breathe until after the click. He took the tape to Hal. "Friends call you late," he said, and pressed play again. "You know how kids are," Hal said after, schooling his face into practical. "Pranks." "Kids who know crew codes," Jack said. "Kids who say same as last time into a machine in your office." Hal looked past him at the docks, at a winter that had turned men careful. "You want to ask it straight," he said. "Ask. Did Even Keel go out after midnight?" "Even Keel's on blocks," Hal said. "Go ask Pike. And take a look at your own ghost while you're at it." Windward's office had once sold postcards. The faded displays remembered clouds arranged on purpose. The sign had lost the D and leaned into WINWAR. Nolan Pike met him with a grin, tuned to a volume he could afford. "Winterized," he said before hello. "We're legal. Batteries out, fuel lines capped. We're mugs of cocoa and shore leave till May." "Key rack says different," Jack said. More nails than keys. 2 empty spaces with the absence of things that mattered. A space heater ticked. Solvent fumed the air from the back. Jenna Boyd came in wiping her hands on a rag, hair tucked away, eyes that held still. "If you're here to fine us for bad coffee, the line's long," she said. "Bad locks," Jack said. "A boat that dries slower than morning dew. And a matchbook in a girl's trash, stamped with your name." Pike's grin didn't crack. It cooled. "Tourists leave things. We can't stop them." "Tourists leave in August," Jenna said, mostly to the room. She met Jack's face and didn't look away. "What do you need?" "Your winterization logs," Jack said, and Pike tugged open a drawer that stuck hard. Forms leaned into uniformity. Even Keel winterized October 28th. Battery removed. Fuel line capped. Key transferred to Harbormaster for off-season storage. Boxes checked with the confidence of ink. "Anyone else run your boats?" Jack asked. "My mother," Pike said. "Sundays." Jack left without giving the room the satisfaction of seeing what he was thinking. Back at Seaside Pines, Claire had an envelope with letters, cut from a boating magazine. "Storm's coming. Stay ashore." The paper smelled faintly of oil and citrus cleaner. He held it by a corner in gloved fingers. "Anyone asking questions this morning?" he asked. "Man with a limp," Claire said. "Local. Wanted to know if Emily ever went to the park at night. Brown jacket. Work boots. Name?" "He didn't say, and I didn't ask," she said, and slid the guest book across. A page had been torn free. She winced. "I thought I heard the door at dawn, but we don't lock the front when someone's missing." He found the name on a previous page, C. Keene, 2 nights ago. He knew a Martin Keene, adjunct out of Maine who liked to ride the summer into late fall, teaching about fisheries and economies, to people who'd learned the words, not the water. He wrote down the number. Outside the Narrows, he saw a limp under a brown jacket in the window's reflection. "Caleb," he said, and the man turned. Caleb Dunn had the stubborn look of someone the town had stopped believing, or never started believing in the first place. "I didn't do anything," he said reflexively. "You asked about Emily. You find a jacket near the park?" "Found a navy one by the rocks," Caleb said, "torn at the seam. I was going to bring it by." "You didn't run boats for Windward last night," Jack said. "No," Caleb said, and he meant it. "I listen. That's what men do when they're not the ones being asked." Back on the board in the squad room, structure calmed the air. Victim Emily Hart. Last seen the Narrows, 11:17 p.m. Receipt coffee, blueberry pie. Phone 11:22 p.m. to harbor office. Matchbook Windward. Slip 7 fresh scuffs. Fabric navy scrap, Otter Point. Ledger erasure, pressure ridges. He added voices. 717, same as last time. He wrote names into suspect columns because boards like columns as much as cases do. Hal Crowley, harbor master. Motive, keep docks quiet, off-book favors, reputation. Alibi, home. Secret, ledger manipulation. Nolan Pike Windward owner. Motive, off-season cash, debt. Alibi, winterized. Secret, missing keys, tidy lies. Jenna Boyd mechanic. Motive, loyalty, wages. Alibi, alone. Secret, hears engines, keeps them honest for wrong runs. Claire Lund manager. Motive, none apparent. Alibi, at the desk. Secret. Missing guestbook page. Martin Keene academic. Motive. Research stakes. Alibi. Portland. Alleged. Secret. Registered as C. Keene at the motel. Unknown. Peacoat man motive. Alibi. Secret. Watched the phone. Left without paying. He didn't add Eli. People who tell you the truth badly don't need their names on bad lists. He narrowed the night further. The payphone records showed one more outgoing number after midnight that didn't resolve to a listing. He wrote 555-137 and circled it. Some numbers live in shadows by design. He found Martin Keene in the University Extension office, paper stacked to the edges of belief. Keene's tweed made him look like he wanted to be believed by people who graded belief. "Emily's bright," he said. "Reliable. She asked the right questions. I brought her a source packet 2 nights ago. She wasn't there. Left it with the office." "You hear anything about Windward?" Jack asked. "People talk," Keene said, and the word, people, did a lot of work. Night tours past season for cash. Packages with legs. I don't have names." He spread his hands like he was showing empty pockets. "I'm not your guy." "You are if you're hiding someone else's name," Jack said. Keene's silence answered enough. He stopped at the phone company's low building outside town, where the receptionist knew how to turn suspicion into records without asking for a lecture. He put in a request for incoming, outgoing, beyond the first page. The dot matrix spooled with a patience that made his fingers gray. He took the stack back to the station and marked the line that mattered. The payphone's 11:22 p.m. call to the harbor office, the harbor office machine's timestamp, then the second number at 12:04 a.m., 555-37. Registered? Unknown. Pagers and cash leave shallow footprints. He went back to Windward because the shed had more to say to a man with a small crowbar than to a man with a badge alone. The padlock on the side door had the self-confidence of cheap hardware. Inside, the air held a tightness that belongs to spaces trying to keep secrets. Even Keel's tarp was too careful, and not careful enough. He eased a corner and found deck boards wet in a way that said, "Last night," not morning. Under the forward seat, a metal box held flares, a flashlight, a paper tide table for November, 3 dates circled in pencil. The 5th, the 10th, the 12th. 5 years ago, Timothy Lafferty vanished on the 10th. Emily Hart failed to clock in on the 12th. He didn't trust coincidence in fog. A step outside. Light shifted in the seam. He stayed still until the breath he'd saved went stale. The light moved on. Jenna stood at the corner when he stepped out, hands in pockets, wrench at ease. "You going to report the lock or the engine?" she asked. "You know about the circles," he said. "People circle dates for all kinds of reasons," she said. "Some are honest." "You hear engines after midnight?" he asked. She studied him for a beat. "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes I don't tell the person who asks me." "You think Emily got on that boat?" he asked. "I think some men think fog is a permission slip," she said. "I think they're wrong." He didn't push further. Not yet. The circle of dates had become a gear in his head. It would turn regardless. At home, Susan had stew and a look that had learned to hold the calm while the storm did what it wanted outside. "Don't let them take those last 3 months," she said. "I won't," he promised. And they both knew promises get tested hardest where water and ink meet. The pager yanked him at 3 a.m. A scorched patch near the breakwater hissed in the damp air. Not gasoline. Too clean. Flare burn. Fired from or toward the water. Either way, a conversation men had at a distance. He put the ash in a bag and labeled the bag, because you always label, even when nobody's looking. He went to the breakwater anyway, alone, and stood where the harbor folded itself into silence. Wind and water negotiated. At 12:12 the night before, EVEN KEEL could have slid out. He pictured the line between the marker and the bell and heard a Hull's whisper in his teeth. The place sound lives when you can't see. By daylight, the clerks at the pager company knew his name again and decided to be helpful. A whisper came back fast through a back channel the town had with small technologies. 555-13D7, resolved to a beeper rented cash at a storefront in Ellsworth. Contact listed as Operations. Cross-reference Crowley Marine Services on a second beeper for Maintenance Alerts. A shadow lengthened at Hal's feet, whether Hal knew it or not. He didn't confront Hal again. Not yet. He consolidated. He took the tape from the harbor office answering machine and made a clean copy. He drew the line in thick ink on the board. Payphone 11:22 p.m. to harbor office. Machine voice, 717, same as last time. He wrote 7017. Slip 7, as if any jury would understand cruise and code without translation. He added the tide windows for the 10th and 12th in 2 years, separated by 5 Novembers. He didn't write the part of his chest that burned when the dates hovered together. That part didn't make boards. It made mistakes. He stopped at the Narrows again and asked Marla to walk the moments back. He was older than the girl, she said of the peacoat man. Worked with his hands. He kept looking at the door like he'd regret it if he waited. "Did they talk?" Jack asked. "They looked like people do when they've decided not to know each other right there," she said. Which is a way of knowing each other. He copied that phrasing in his head. There are sentences that anchor nights. He met the day at the park where the cliffs bruise the water. Peter Sadowski had flagged the place carefully. Prints muddled by rain. A lip of rock that makes fools out of people who trust postcards. Jack held the fabric scrap again and let the damp bite. He pictured a staged walk. Footprints neat to the edge. A story told in mud. He pictured the true way people go when they're done. They don't go neat. He drove back through town, the cold catching his teeth, and bought milk because life insisted. The house held. The board did not. He went back to the station and spread 2 files like maps of the same coast. Emily Hart, 23, seasonal worker finishing a paper on maritime economies, reliable, punctual. Timothy Lafferty, 28, deckhand, restless, debt like a bruise. The town folder held no connection. The harbor folder held 1 in ink. At dusk, he returned to slip 7. Night thickened until the water and sky agreed to be one surface. On the cleat, bright against dull metal, an envelope was taped. A single Polaroid slid out grain and blur, a tarp and a figure shaped by bad light. On the back, a time and a number. 1:15, the number traced to a payphone outside the shuttered arcade, the one that had summer in it like a memory it couldn't shake. He shouldn't have gone. He went. The phone rang to a slow rhythm. He held it hot to his ear and listened to street noise and the small shiver of the coast. 15 minutes in, a breathy voice pushed low. "You want to know where she went?" it said. "Go to the park. Check the tide table. Same window. Same boat. Some mistakes you only make twice." "Who is this?" he asked. "Someone who made the first one," the voice said. And the line went quiet. He drove the park road without lights until the asphalt learned his tires by sound. He stood where the breakwater married the dark and checked his watch until numbers didn't mean time anymore. He didn't see the boat, not in a way a report would accept, but he heard the water argue with a hull and saw a flare breathe red against the fog a mile out, then die with a hiss. He went to the harbor office in the morning, the cold in his bones now part of his weight, and asked for last night's ledger sheets and the week before. Hal obliged with the calm of a man who had trained himself to be calm. Jack angled the carbon against the light. Erasures leave scars. Pressure leaves ghosts. On a line just after midnight, the ridges spelled a name someone had tried to bleach with patience. EVENKEEL. Time, 12:12 outbound. 4 inches left, a hand had pressed harder where it never had to for fee totals or frost dates. A nervous hand or a new one. Hal's signature sat at the bottom of both pages. 5 years apart. 2 nights joined by ink, no matter how many fingers you rubbed over it. He took the copy, copied the copy, and didn't look at Hal until he could trust his face. When he did, Hal was staring at the window, at a harbor that looked exactly like itself. "You've got a theory," Hal said. "I've got a rope," Jack said. "One end in 90, one end last night. Pull hard enough and see what falls." He drove to Emily's motel room once more, and because neat people hide their insistence in corners, he found the notebook under the mattress elastic. Emily's hand marched clean. Landings, fees, tide windows, oddities and harbor traffic for 3 months. She had circled Windward once, written "Slip 7 in fog only Y" in a margin, drawn lines between weather and ledger anomalies until the lines spelled names. He made copies and left the original to hand back when the time came to switch apology for answer. He went home because Susan would worry, and he let the house teach him how to breathe for an hour. The old file stayed on the table, no longer the only ghost in the room. By noon, the phone company printout on his desk told a simpler story than men usually do. The payphone outside the Narrows called the harbor office at 11:22 p.m. The harbor office rolled to a machine that recorded a code in a voice that had said the same words 5 Novembers ago to the same kind of night. Slip 7, same as last time. He stared long enough for the letters to go out of focus, then wrote them again as if new ink could make the truth fresh. He looked at the wall where 5 Novembers hung like pictures of the same storm, taken with different cameras. He felt the old wound flare and understood that the warranty on his quiet 3 months had expired. 2 cases were now one line, straight as the channel markers, pointing out to water. He was going to follow it to the edge, and then keep going. By late afternoon, the wind went north, and the fog tore into strips that clung to the pines. Jack stood over the board until the coffee went cold and the questions grew edges. Patterns had faces now. He needed ink, not only intuition. Emily's notebook gave him ink. Tucked under the motel mattress like a secret that wanted to be found, its elastic tired and loyal, it mapped the town's winter in tidy handwriting. Landings, fees, tide windows, oddities in harbor traffic for 3 months. In the margins, she'd written, "Slip 7 fog only." Why? And circled Windward once, as if refusing to give a rumor more dignity than it deserved. On 2 dates, she'd drawn small triangles next to tide times, the 10th and the 12th, the same 2 he kept in his head for different reasons. She wasn't chasing ghosts. She was counting them until they turned into men. He made copies and put the original in an envelope to hand back when it could do more comfort than harm. The dot matrix stack from the phone company slouched on his desk like a pet that had done its job. The payphone behind the Narrows had called the harbor office at 11:22 p.m., and the harbor machine had swallowed a code it had learned 5 years ago. Another line traced out to 5537 after midnight. Not listed, of course. Pagers and cash prefer the shallow end of records. The clerk's kid, who liked the feeling of being useful where it mattered, called with a whisper. That 137 beeper routes to a dockside payphone by the arcade and to a second beeper listed to Crowley Marine Services maintenance alerts. The rental paperwork says Ellsworth. Cash. Good work, Jack said. The words had weight. The line from phone to machine to beeper to boat had a shape a judge could follow. He walked to the harbor office and stood in Hal's doorway long enough to be noticed. Hal looked up, a man used to being the fixed point in other people's storms. "You building a story?" he asked. "A case," Jack said. He set the tape recorder on the desk and pressed play. 717, same as last time. The sound came thin and tinny, and somehow larger than either of them could contain. "Kids," Hal said, trying on a shrug. "Codes leak. People hear things. Off-season's longer than Pride is cheap." "Your maintenance beeper took calls after midnight," Jack said. "You've got erasures that remember names. If you're not part of this, someone's using your shadow." Hal's mouth did something like a laugh without humor. "The town runs on shadows 6 months out of the year," he said. "You want me to turn on all the lights?" "Turn on one," Jack said, and left before anger could do his thinking for him. Windward smelled like solvent and winter. Nolan Pike had a mug of coffee he didn't need, and a defensiveness he didn't bother to hide. "We're winterized," he said. "Battery out, fuel line capped. Ask the insurance adjuster." "Your deck dried wrong," Jack said. "Your key rack has empty nails. Your matchbook was in Emily Hart's room. The payphone outside the Narrows spit a call into Hal's machine last night, and someone said, 'Slip 7 like it was a password. If I stand on the breakwater at 12:12 and look east, what will I see?'" Pike's smile flickered like bad neon. "Fog," he said. "You'll see fog." In the back, Jenna Boyd pretended to fuss with a wrench until pretending looked like pain. "You want an answer?" she said to Jack without asking permission. "Here's one. Off-season kills slow. Guys run tours for cash. Sometimes they move packages that don't smell like fish. I told Nolan to stop. He didn't." "And Hal?" Jack said. "Hal writes 2 ledgers," she said. "One for the town, one for how it actually works. Don't ask me where he keeps the second. If I knew, we wouldn't be talking in here." "You hear engines last night?" he asked. "Sometimes I hear engines," she said. "Sometimes I don't tell anyone because telling doesn't change the wind." "Were you on the boat?" he asked. "At home," she said, and let the lack of an alibi sit there and do nothing for either of them. Seaside Pines' office bell rang behind him as he pushed the door. Claire Lund had worry lines and an envelope. "Found this under the door," she said. The paper smelled like oil and citrus cleaner. Letters cut from a boating magazine. "Storm's coming. Stay ashore." "Anyone else ask about Emily?" he asked. "Man with a limp," Claire said. "Brown jacket, work boots, this morning. Didn't give a name." Jack found Caleb Dunn near the edge of town coiling rope into a truck that had opinions. "You looking for me? Caleb asked, already defensive, as if habits had called before Jack did. You left a Polaroid at slip 7, Jack said. You called the arcade phone at 1:15. You said same as last time to Hal's machine 5 years after you didn't say anything at all. Tell me what you did the first time. Caleb stared at a space where forgiveness might someday stand. I held a line, he said. Tim got on to make a delivery. We went out under dark. Out past the bell there was shouting. I couldn't hear words, just the shape of money and pride. A lurch. He went over. The rope missed. The night swallowed the sound. We came back with the lights off. Hal took the pen. We all pretended it was weather. You left him, Jack said quietly. Caleb's face changed the way men's faces change when they choose a reckoning. We threw a rope, he repeated. And that was not absolution, but it was all he had. I called you last night because I've been alive 5 years that he hasn't. I thought if you saw the flare in the window, you'd know it wasn't the weather, then, and it isn't now. You'll wear a wire, Jack said. You'll call the number that calls you. You'll say their words back to them until they own them out loud. You'll testify. Caleb nodded like a man taking up a weight that fitted the shape of his back. The next circled tide window was tonight. The plan needed eyes and a boat with authority. Jack called the Coast Guard substation in Southwest Harbor and used a language men learn when they need help without drama. He got a cutter on idle near the park lights, dark as a held breath. He asked for patience and promised paperwork. Hancock County would get its call when the time came to turn water into court. He slid a microphone under Caleb's collar and tested it with a scratch and a radio click. You'll say slip 7, same as last time, he said. You'll hint you have leverage. You'll keep your answers short and dumb. Don't impress anyone. Caleb's smile was quick and tired. That I can do. They staged the call by the arcade's payphone because that was the place the numbers liked to visit. The cold worked their fingers until coins felt like stones. The beeper buzzed. The phone rang back. Jack crouched behind a newspaper box and listened to a voice he did not have to see to recognize. Nolan Pike's caution couldn't hide the grain of his vowels. Same window, Nolan said. Same as last time, no delays. I have the girl, Caleb said, steady. We run regardless, Nolan said. Slip 7, bell to bell. You don't show, you don't call again. The line died. Jack keyed the radio twice. One affirmative came back from the cutter. Another, softer, from a skiff that didn't ask permission. Eli Morin was where wise men drew lines and then stepped a half-inch over. At 11:40, the harbor held the kind of quiet that hums. Hal locked the office with careful hands, took a walk that ended at the only place. Walks end when you're pretending to think, the slip that had learned how to lie without moving. Even Keel eased out from under its tarp, like a hand from a pocket. Jenna, a silhouette with a wrench, passed a coil to Nolan. She saw Jack in the dark and gave a small shake of her head. Plea, warning, both. He raised a palm. Not now. Jack didn't jump. 58 and alive had taught him about cost and benefit. He watched the shape of the boat and filed away the weight of how she rode. A second figure stood at the bow, hat low. No sign of Emily. He keyed the radio and started the long walk to the breakwater with the kind of careful pace that keeps men out of cold water. At 12:12, the sound came first, soft as a memory, the hulls whisper against the channel. A flare climbed and carved the fog in red. The name on the stern burned clear for a second. EVEN KEEL. The cutter's horn coughed authority waking without theater. A searchlight seamed the fog with a white blade and made EVEN KEEL look smaller than she hoped. Nolan throttled up, stubborn and predictable. Eli's skiff slid in like someone's second thought and made a hook hold fast without flipping either boat. United States Coast Guard, the boarding officer said, brisk, no need to shout. Engine off. When Nolan didn't obey fast enough, the officer reached, skilled and calm, and did with hands what orders hadn't done with words. The second figure went to the deck hard. Jack stepped on, weight honest, and moved the tarp. Emily Hart lay there, wrists taped, eyes bright and furious with life. He cut the tape and helped her up. She blinked against the light and said, "Thank you," in a voice that turned gratitude into breath. He put his coat around her shoulders and felt the shiver that comes when adrenaline remembers you're a person. "Am I under arrest?" Nolan asked no one in particular. "Yes," Jack said. "You are." "On what?" Nolan started, and stopped when he saw the tide table in Jack's hand, the flare residue on the deck, the boarding officer who had no interest in philosophy. Jenna stood on the dock when they brought the boat back, hands in pockets, wrench gone. "I kept engines alive that should have slept," she said before he asked. "I'll say that in any room you want." "You'll testify," Jack said. "I will," she said, and something in her posture settled. Hal Crowley didn't run. Men like Hal don't, not if they've built a life out of being where people expect them. He stood at slip 7 with his hands in his pockets, like he could keep one last thing. "Nolan's a fool," he said quietly. "A useful one." "You wrote nights out of the ledger," Jack said. "You wrote a code onto your machine. You kept a second beeper for when the town needed to look the other way on schedule." "I kept the docks from turning into a graveyard," Hal said, and anger made it sound noble. "You arrest men for doing what the town expects. You'll have more empty plates than prayers. Boston doesn't send checks. Winter doesn't send mercy." "Tim Lafferty went overboard," Jack said. "You had a chance to drag the truth in and you made a ledger." Hal swallowed. "I told them to bring him in," he said, and looked at the water. "They didn't. They came back with a story. I wrote it because I was tired of telling men they'd made their own bad luck." Jack recited Miranda clearly and evenly because procedure helps everyone remember where they stand. Hal listened without argument and put his wrists out with the composure of a man who had decided how he would be seen. "Don't make me do the walk," he said. "You kept too many things," Jack said, and let him in anyway, the town's breath behind them. At the hospital, Emily asked for a pen. She wrote names as if writing could hold the world steady. "He said he had documents," she told Jack. "He said the park would be quiet. He watched me walk to the phone, then left without paying his bill." She described the boat, the steps from the motel to the diner, to the payphone to the docks, with the detail of someone who memorizes to stay whole. "I counted pilings by feel," she said. "Slip 7 creaks different." Back at the station, the board shed rumors like a wet dog. The chain ran clean. Payphone call to harbor machine, code to slip, beeper to boat, flare to name, ledger to erasure, tide window to habit, Emily to alive. He put 2 files side by side and saw one line dressed in different dates. He didn't sleep. He wrote instead, because writing keeps men tied to masts. The next morning, a tech from Bangor put Hal's ledger on a light box and lifted the ghosts that paper carries when it can't forgive. Even Keel walked out of the erasures twice, 5 years ago and last night. The pressure ridges the same hand, pressing harder on the same place. The DA's office in Hancock County liked that. Paper doesn't get nervous on a stand. Nolan blustered and then bargained. He liked the word tour more than the word run. He liked accident more than negligence. He liked we never touched her, because for once it was true. He gave up 3 names from out of town, the kind of men who think the coast is anonymous if it's cold enough. He said Hal had said, "Fix it," as if those words could sit between intent and outcome and make a fence. He said Jenna had said, "Don't," which was the first thing anyone said that made him look good. Jenna sat across from Jack and stared at the varnished tabletop like it owed her a straight line. "I'll say the parts I did," she said. And the parts I watched. And the parts I should have done and didn't. You're not the villain of your own story, he said. I'm not the hero either, she said. He went to the shed behind Windward and popped the chart drawer by feel. A thin ledger hid behind the charts like a conscience. Blocky entries in Nolan's hand. 10th delivery, 12th pickup, HOK, COK. Numbers that didn't fit diner cash tickets. He pictured the DA's smile and let himself think about outcomes that held. By dusk, the town's story about winter had changed. It wasn't fog taking people. It was people using it and getting caught. The board at the station had fewer question marks and more arrows. Hal sat in a holding cell with a look that belonged to a man who'd spent a career deciding what other men deserved and had been forced, late, to look at himself. Nolan learned how to be quiet too late. Caleb signed papers with a hand that had learned how to shake. Jack drove home under a sky that let a few stars through the cloud like apologies. Susan had a hand on his shoulder before he decided how to speak. You'll sleep tonight, she said. For a few hours, he said. You'll give them back those 5 years? She asked. No one can, he said. But we can make sure they stop repeating. He returned to the board one last time before morning. He drew a line from 1990 to now and wrote the simplest sentence he could. Same boat, same window, different ending. He capped his pen and let the room settle. The first time had been a lurch and a rope thrown too late. This time had been a flare and a light, and a hand on an engine that cut when ordered. When dawn came thin and clean, the bell buoy told where it always had. But it didn't sound like a warning anymore. It sounded like a clock. The work after a night like that never felt like victory. It felt like inventory. Jack came in early and listed what would stand in the bright rooms and what would not. Paper would. Tape would. Tide tables would. Flares leave residue even on men who insist they're careful. He wrote it all clean, then wrote it again for an audience that didn't like poetry and didn't trust feelings. Prosecutors, jurors, judges who had learned to look at the world in verbs. Hancock County's DA was younger than Jack wanted him to be, and more careful than the town gave him credit for. He walked through the board the way men walk through sheds in storms. Steady, no flinching at the parts that creaked. We'll charge Pike with kidnapping, conspiracy, and endangering, he said, indexing with a capped pen. We'll charge Crowley with tampering, conspiracy, and accessory after. We can't make murder without a body. For Lafferty, we make negligence and obstruction breathe. Jenna? Jack asked. A cooperating witness, the DA said. Truth buys a smaller box. He didn't smile when he said it. They put Hal's ledger on a light box in a windowless room and let patience do the trick. A tech with gentle hands raised the ghosts from the paper until they stood like old men at a town hall, unwilling to speak, unable to leave. Even Keel appeared twice in pressure and pattern. Same hand, same line, same hour, on nights, 5 years apart and last night. The tech slid the acetate onto a backing that would not smudge under cross. Jack felt a knot in his chest loosen and reform, like a rope retied for a different load. Emily Hart came back with a hospital blanket and a backbone. In the interview room's thin light, she kept her voice level and brief. He said documents, she told him of the man in the peacoat. He said the park would be quiet. He watched me walk toward the phone like he was timing how long I'd be alone. She described the tape over her wrists, the way the dock planks felt under the soles of her sneakers, the count of pilings, the change in the creek where Slip 7's age showed. He wore work gloves that smelled like fuel, she added, an afterthought that gave the room more shape. You want an advocate, Jack said, because he had learned to offer the thing that made the next part survivable. I want my life back, she said. But yes, an advocate too. News traveled in Bar Harbor the way fog does, through every seam, under doors that fit tight. By noon, the bait shop was quoting charges, and the diner was rehearsing verdicts, and at least one man, who had once shaken Hal's hand for the camera, said the word betrayal, like he'd practiced it all morning. Jack didn't attend the meeting at town hall. He didn't need to. He'd been to enough to know which phrases would come and how the room would end. We have to be better. This is not who we are. Winter is long. People are people. Don't close the docks. Close them tighter. Everyone right in small ways. Everyone wrong in ways that matter. He made choices he could defend. He took a sworn statement from Jenna, recorded clear and plain. He took a fuller one from Caleb Dunn, with counsel present, the microphone clean, the dates nailed to the board with pins that wouldn't slip. Caleb didn't fashion himself into a hero. He built the scene as it was. The night, the lurch, the rope, the ledger, the 5 years he had worn like a coat that didn't fit. The DA listened and didn't thank him. Thanks come late, if at all. Internal Affairs called midweek to ask about a lock and a crowbar. Jack said what needed saying before anyone else could say it. I entered the shed to preserve evidence I believed would be moved or destroyed, he said. The lock was inadequate. The risk calculus favored action. The man on the phone wrote it down with a tone that promised a note in a file and a quiet reprimand. Jack took the cost now, so the bigger thing wouldn't wobble later. Pike's lawyer liked volume. At arraignment, he hit harassment, small business, routine tours, hard, and let kidnapping come out quiet. The judge set bail with a number that understood what men could do with a night in a boat. Hal's lawyer wore gray and patience. Long service, he said. Misjudgment. The judge listened to the tape of the answering machine. 7Y7, same as last time. And his eyes did a thing that suggested he had left the room without moving. He set bail anyway, because procedure had lanes, and the town had no better place to put a man like Hal except behind paper for now. Jack went home to change his shirt before a meet with the Coast Guard liaison. Susan watched him tuck the badge without comment. How much longer, she asked, until this part is done? A season, he said, and it felt accurate and wrong. Seasons don't end because you want them to. On the water, the Coast Guard's narrative read like a checklist, which is what saved lives. Boarding initiated on reasonable suspicion after visual identification and signal. Engine cut for safety. Persons secured. One adult female located under tarp, with wrists bound. Knife used to cut tape. Medical handoff. Vessel impounded. The seaman who had said, United States Coast Guard, at the right volume and no more, shook Jack's hand outside the courthouse with the quick warmth of a man who had done his job and didn't need credit. Glad we were there, he said. Glad you called before we had a body. The town, hungry for endings, pretended it had one. Jack watched this from a distance. Endings, in his experience, came in pieces, and never in the order people wanted. He took Emily's notebook to the DA and watched the man line it up next to tide tables and pager logs like a carpenter laying boards. A structure emerged that could hold weight. He let himself believe that for a breath. Witnesses came clean or didn't. Marla at the Narrows told the truth without embroidery and suffered for it anyway in the way she looked at the door when the bell rang. Martin Keene played at distance until the DA produced his Motel signature in C. Keene's neat curve and a train stub that put him in Portland when he wanted to be nowhere. He didn't break, he bent. He would be a witness the defense could try to shake. Jack wrote that on a note and slid it under the DA's file. He went back to slip 7 because place matters. The scuffs had dulled to an ordinary dark you could miss if you wanted to. He didn't want to. He stood long enough to earn a look from a kid on a bicycle who had borrowed a hat 2 sizes too big. You catch 'em? The kid asked. We caught enough, Jack said. Good, the kid said, and rode off like the town would be different by dinner. At the office, a delivery waited. A small, beat-up box with a torn label and a smell of salt. Inside, a coil of line and a note in block letters, hand-drawn, not clipped. Pay your debts. The DA wanted it bagged, tagged, traced for prints that wouldn't exist. Susan wanted him to bring the box home and throw it in the trash. Jack left it where it belonged, in a locker the department kept for threats that wanted the dignity of fear. The price for this kind of justice isn't fear, so much as the recognition that the men you arrest are connected to men with quieter hands. He called Emily's mother with the update a grown man should give. She's okay, he said. Not okay, like the word means when people say it after dinner, but okay, like safe. The woman breathed and then breathed again, and the sound went into the room like light. When the trial calendar got serious, so did the town. Reporters came up on Route 3 and tried to pretend they were not tourists. Someone from Portland TV stood outside the Narrows and had Marla in the frame until Jack stood in the doorway and looked at the camera and the cameraman, and the producer learned the local definition of no. The story would be told whether he helped or not, but he could keep it from turning into a postcard. Pike pled to lesser on one count in exchange for names and dates and a map of cash. He wanted to bargain all the way down the stairs. I never touched the girl, he said, as if that shrinking qualified as virtue. Jack didn't answer. The DA did. You touched the night, he said, and wrote numbers on paper. Hal didn't plead. Pride or habit took him to a table and a microphone. He sat where men sit when the town has found a new story for them, and he listened while the ledger on the lightbox did the part he refused to do. The defense painted him as a steward of a fragile winter economy. The prosecution painted him as a man who had learned to put ink where conscience should go. The tape of 7:20, same as last time, played through a speaker that made it sound worse. The jury went out with a look that belonged to people handed a scale and told to weigh fog. They came back with words that landed without drama: guilty on tampering, guilty on conspiracy, guilty accessory after. The judge's sentencing speech was short and avoided sermons. You were trusted, he said. You made that trust expensive. Jack didn't attend Nolan's sentencing. He'd learned which rooms improved him and which didn't. He went to the park instead, stood with Peter Sadowski at the place where the rock made a lip. We tell them not to go at night, Peter said. But they go. They go, Jack said, and other people take them. He drove to see Tim Lafferty's mother on a day that smelled like thaw, even though freeze was still ahead. They stood by the breakwater and listened to the bell. Do we get a body? She asked, voice level, eyes on the horizon, because sometimes the horizon felt closer than town. I don't know, he said. We get this. He told her the parts that mattered. The ledger, the flare, the name on a stern, the tape that remembered codes, the way men's stories had finally agreed with paper. She let that sit. It isn't what I asked for, she said softly. But it's more than what I had. That's the least of it, he said. It should have been the least 5 years ago. He cleaned his office not because it was time yet, but because order helped. The box that would go home in March collected objects that looked like they could have been anyone's. A stapler that clicked when it liked a sentence, a coffee mug the color of bad weather, a photo of Susan and their boy at a parade, in a year before he'd learned how to miss things on purpose. He put in the old file on Lafferty, and then took it out because filing a ghost felt like hubris. He left it on the desk a while longer. Internal Affairs decided the crowbar merited a reprimand, and the chief delivered it with the careful tone of a man who knows how to hold two ideas at once. You get your pension, the chief said. You get your box. You get 2 dock workers who will spit when you pass. That's the price today. Tomorrow's could be different. Jack signed the paper that said he'd been told, because the ritual heals the part of the institution that broke. He went home and told Susan the whole thing this time. She listened and put her hand on his sleeve. "You didn't have to take that lock," she said, but her voice did not carry the weight of a scold. "If I hadn't," he said, "the ledger would be ash." "You're not a firefighter," she said, "but some days you carried water." She stared out the window. "We're almost done." "Almost," he said, and felt how that word lived differently in the body depending on whether you were talking about months or years. Emily finished her paper and did the thing good students do when they want to make meaning on top of safety. She made it better. She added a chapter about how off-season economies make incentives that look like weather until you touch them and find fingers. She gave Jack a copy with a note that didn't spend adjectives. "Thank you." He put it in the drawer, where he kept the small reasons not to leave this work bitter. Caleb came to the station on a Tuesday and signed the last page he needed to sign. He sat after, like he didn't know what to do with his hands. "You'll be named," Jack said. "Some will call you a rat. Some will call you late. Some will shake your hand when no one's looking." "They already do all that," Caleb said without self-pity. "You going to stay?" Jack asked. "For now," Caleb said. "The water doesn't care if I do." The town adjusted the way towns do, messy, partial, sincere in patches. The Rotary Club found new words for service. The diner found a way to seat people who wanted to talk about everything but the thing. WINDWARD replaced a sign and hired a different lawyer. Jenna put in for work abroad, a shipyard 2 states south that wanted hands and didn't ask questions that would take all day to answer. "You going to leave?" Jack asked, in a last conversation that felt like it belonged to both of them. "I'm going to try earning money that lets me sleep," she said. "If I can't, I'll come back and try again wrong." He gave her a card with a number that would still work after March. "Use it," he said. She nodded, and that was that. He gave a statement for a civil suit filed by a mother who had learned to live with a hole and wanted the town to feel the edge of it. The lawyers asked in polite voices why the first case had gone cold. He answered in honest ones. Time, weather, men who lied well, and papers that lied better. He left feeling like he'd done the right thing and the insufficient thing at the same time. The night before he turned in his badge, he walked to the boardwalk. The payphone stood where it always had, receiver heavy, chrome dull. He picked it up and listened to a dial tone that sounded like a flat C. He hadn't believed in omens since he learned how to testify, but he let himself believe this. A phone that worked meant the next person would not have to shout to be heard. He put the receiver back and stood long enough to be cold. At home, Susan had packed the box he'd left half-packed because she knew the ways his mind evaded endings. "We can go away in April," she said. "Not far. Just to remind ourselves the map is bigger than this town." "Acadia's big enough," he said, and smiled because she wanted farther, and he wanted closer, and both answers were love. He slept deep and woke once to the sound of a buoy bell in his head, and not outside, which seemed like the sort of mercy that comes late and still matters. His last day felt like all last days. Too much cake, too many photos, a speech from the chief that tried to be funny and settled for grateful. He gave the badge over and felt lighter and then heavier, like a boat taking new water in a way that wasn't danger yet. He shook hands with men who had taught him and men he had taught. He found the board stripped of its ghosts and felt a gentle regret at the emptiness. Outside, Eli Morin leaned against his truck and nodded at the harbor. "You'll miss this," Eli said. "I'll miss being useful," Jack said. "You still will be," Eli said. "Just not with a radio." He tipped his hat and got in his truck, and drove like a man who had never been in a hurry, because the tide doesn't care. Jack walked the long way home, past the arcade whose payphone had been a mouth for bad plans, past the Narrows, where Marla refilled cups with the rhythm of a metronome that had finally learned a slower song, past the harbor office window, where Hal had stood and believed paperwork could make new weather. The window was dark. The door was locked. A sign said, "Closed for inventory," a joke the town had earned. He went to the breakwater because it had become habit. The water moved as if nothing had happened, which was true, and which was why people needed paper. He stood, counted breaths, watched a gull draw the same imperfect circle and make it perfect, because repetition turns flaws to pattern. He thought of Tim Lafferty as a man, and not a file. He thought of Emily as a future, and not a victim. He thought of Nolan as someone who had learned the wrong math, and of Hal as someone who had learned the wrong prayer. He went home and didn't look back until he had to cross the street. You don't step into unknowns without checking for cars. Susan took his coat and hung it, and he made a joke about it being heavier than it looked, and she didn't laugh, because sometimes jokes are spells, and sometimes they're just noise. They ate dinner without the radio on. They did the crossword and left 3 clues for morning. They went to bed and did not talk about what they had survived, because naming it would make it sound closer. He slept. In the morning he woke without the pager in his mind, and the absence was loud and beautiful. He poured coffee and stood at the window. The fog lay in a thin sheet that let the edges show. The bell buoy tolled, and it sounded less like warning now, more like a clock that belonged to a town that had learned something the hard way. He didn't plan to go by the station, but habit makes its own plans. He walked in with an excuse about returning a book and left a note on a desk that wasn't his anymore. Same boat, same window, different ending. J. He didn't sign detective because that wasn't true today, and accuracy mattered. On the way out, a young officer stopped him and said, "My dad says you solved the Lafferty case." "No," Jack said. "We made it so people could stop lying about it." "That's something," the kid said. "It is," Jack said, and meant it. He spent the afternoon doing nothing and found out it was work. He sat on the back steps and watched light move. He fixed a hinge he'd been ignoring. He found the dent in the kitchen table with his thumb, and the memory of a Pinewood Derby car, and a boy who had gone and come back and gone again, because that's what boys do. He took a walk with Susan, and they didn't talk about the case until they did, briefly, in the tone of people cleaning away crumbs. Near dusk, a letter came in the mailbox with a Portland postmark and no return. Inside, a photo, not a Polaroid, printed on good paper Emily in a cap and gown 2 years from now, probably, smiling in a way that didn't apologize. A note. "Thank you for the clock." He showed it to Susan, and she looked at him like he'd brought home something he hadn't known how to ask for. A week later, a call from the DA, sentencing date set, victim statement scheduled, a request that Jack sit in the front for optics. He said he'd sit where they put him. He went and listened while Emily spoke in a voice that didn't shake, and a mother spoke in a voice that had learned how to. He didn't look at Hal or Nolan, not because he was noble, but because he didn't need to know what their faces were doing. He watched the judge and the clerk and the clock. He walked out with Susan's hand in his elbow and didn't stop for the cameras. Bar Harbor learned how to say off-season enforcement without making it sound like an insult. The council found money for lights and locks that actually locked. The harbor office got a door that needed a code and a file cabinet that didn't open unless it wanted to. Men learned not to say, "same as last time," into machines. The Rotary raised funds for a scholarship in Tim Lafferty's name, and a debate raged about whether that made it right. It didn't. It made it something. On a Sunday in March, he and Susan drove the park loop before it opened to summer habits. The road was theirs, and the light was theirs, and the water was everyone's. He pointed to a rock and didn't say its name because some names belong to maps and some to memory. Susan leaned her head on the window like she was remembering being younger. "You going to be all right without the work?" she asked. "I think the work will find me," he said. "Men call when they don't know who else to call." "You'll answer?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes I'll let the phone ring." They parked and walked to a place where the path came close to the water, and then decided not to fall in. He put his hand on the fence and felt the grain. He thought of ledgers and flares, and the way paper holds shape when men don't. He thought of a boat sliding out at 12:12, and a voice saying numbers in a tinny room, and the way you can stop a habit by naming it too often. He turned and looked back at the town, which belonged to other people now at noon on a Sunday, and to him in a way that has nothing to do with employment and everything to do with standing up when it's cold. "Let's go home," he said. They did. Spring came in seams, not in a sweep. Ice loosened from dinghy ropes like a grudge giving up late. Jack learned the shape of days without a radio. He ran into people in aisles instead of interview rooms. Marla at the Narrows refilled his coffee and didn't let him tip too much. Peter Sadowski taught him the tide names he'd never bothered to memorize because the job had taught him different ones. Words changed temperature when you weren't holding them for court. He said yes to a talk at the high school because the principal asked in a voice that suggested saying no would mean she'd ask again until he learned. He stood in a gym where banners tried to make decades talk to each other and told a story about patterns and windows and the way small lies make ladders for bigger ones. He did not say names. He did say, "Call anyway," to a room full of kids who would one day be the people who didn't. A boy with a cowlick asked whether he was scared. Jack said yes. The boy nodded, like that answer had made something possible. The department called twice in a month, not because they needed him, but because muscle memory dials the numbers it trusts. The first time he told them to check a bus schedule against a time card. The second, he told them to call the park rangers before they called the Coast Guard. He kept his answers short. He ended the calls before he could say, "we." He wrote a letter to Hal he didn't send. It said, "You were trusted, and you were tired." And those two things are not a defense when they meet. He wrote another to Tim Lafferty's mother that he did send. It had 3 sentences and a signature without rank. He walked it to the mailbox because some things insist on being carried. On a Tuesday that looked like a postcard, he met Jenna for coffee before she left. She wore a jacket that had learned other weather and carried a bag that didn't hold much. "You were right about engines," he said. "I wish I hadn't been," she said. "But I'm better at fixing the thing that exists than the one that should." She looked at his hands. "You'll go crazy if you stop holding tools altogether." "I can fix hinges," he said. "Start there," she said, and took a bus that looked wrong in town until it turned and joined the road that belonged to everyone. He saw Caleb sometimes by accident. They didn't talk if other people were around. Once, by the bait shop, Caleb said, "I sleep more." Jack said, "Good," and meant it. It had taken both of them 5 years to learn how to say one-syllable mercy. The payphone by the Narrows came down on a day advertised as modernization and experienced as grief. A crew with a flatbed and a yellow light took the chrome from the wall, the handset from its cradle. Marla watched with a face that wanted it both ways. Jack didn't sentimentalize. He had heard too much tinny fear through similar speakers. Even so, he stood across the street and felt a hand lay itself on his shoulder from a year he couldn't name. That night, he dreamed a dial tone he couldn't place, and woke smiling anyway. Emily mailed him her finished paper, bound with a black spine, and an academic title that made it sound less sharp than it was. She had written about incentives and winter and the way fog gets blamed for what men choose. At the back, acknowledgments, a list of people who told her the truth when it was inconvenient for them. His name was there. Last. He put the paper on a shelf and touched the spine when he walked past, the way people touch charms without believing in charms. The DA called to say appeals had been filed, as they always are, as they rarely win. Jack said he didn't need updates unless something that hurt was attached. The DA understood and called anyway a week later to say the tampering count had stuck to Hal like a label that wouldn't peel. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't need to. Some men carry sorry in their eyes. On a thin day in April, a bench appeared near the breakwater with a small brass plate that said, "For Tim, who fished this water and didn't get to finish his story." No last name. No dates. If you knew, you knew. If you didn't, you could sit anyway. Jack sat once and then avoided it because he didn't want the habit to turn into a ritual he would have to defend. He and Susan drove down the coast and ate breakfasts in diners that had perfected the art of eggs. They walked in cold sunshine and talked about the rug in the front room and whether to replace it. They bought one and put it down and watched the room agree with itself more readily. He told her a joke Eli had made and realized she had already heard the same joke across town because towns are circles with long delays. He thought about visiting Hal at County and then at the state facility, and then decided that choice belonged to men with more forgiveness in their pockets. He wrote another letter instead, this one shorter. "A ledger is a map," he wrote, "and you drew yours wrong." He folded it and put it in the same drawer as the one he'd never sent, and let both sit there like wires he'd chosen not to connect. Work found him, like he told Susan it would. A neighbor asked him to talk to a contractor who had learned the wrong lesson about deposits. A woman 3 doors down wanted to know how to get a constable to knock on a door without waking a sleeping baby. A kid from the high school sent him an email asking whether it mattered who he told if a friend said something about something. "Tell the person who will make it real fastest," Jack wrote back, "and then tell them again." One morning he woke with an ache that GPS couldn't fix. He put on his coat and walked to the harbor and leaned on a rail and counted gulls. Eli joined him without announcement and stood with him in the silence men use when they mean it. "You're not here because you miss the job," Eli said finally. "I'm here because I miss believing I was the only one standing between the town and what it couldn't admit," Jack said. "You weren't," Eli said. "You never were. Good news is you aren't now." He tipped his hat toward the harbor office, where a new clerk with a square jaw and a nervous pen was putting papers into a cabinet that actually locked. They hired 2 people to do what Hal did alone. It's not a sin to need a second set of hands. "Sometimes it's the opposite," Jack said. They watched a tour bus nose into town like a beast that neither remembered them nor cared. Summer would come whether the town was ready or not. It always did. There would be new names and new hotels and the same water. Jack felt the old ache press less. He took up a habit of walking the loop road before the gates opened. He knew the places where the asphalt held the night longer and the spots where the light jumped first. He saw tourists early who had come to outsmart the calendar and forgave them their insistence because insisting was a way to stay alive. He stopped correcting people about the names of rocks. He kept 2 for himself and let the park keep the rest. One afternoon, he found a letter on his porch with a stamp from out of state and a handwriting he almost placed. Inside, 3 words, "I'm trying to," and a money order to the Rotary scholarship that made him smile and ache. No return. He didn't check the counter at the post office for cameras, didn't ask the clerk for a description. Some mysteries aren't crimes. Some attempts at making it right don't need an audience. He ran into Marla on her day off at the bookstore, and they both pretended they didn't know how to do small talk. "You look tired then," she said. of a night the town had already turned into a story it told tourists when the pie came. "You look less tired now." "I sleep," he said. "That'll do it," she said, and bought a book of poems because people surprise you in ways that make you flat out happy if you let them. The station felt different when he eventually walked back in to return a manual he had forgotten on purpose. New posters, new boots, a young sergeant he'd trained on traffic stops now training someone else on how to breathe when a room got loud. He saw on the board a case about a boat that had been stripped for parts and a suspect list that didn't oversimplify. He wrote one word in the margin tides, and the kid who owned the board nodded like he'd been waiting for that note without knowing it. He went to the bench with the plate on a Wednesday when the sky had ideas. A man sat there already, middle-aged, hat low, hands rough. He slid over without looking up. They shared silence. The bell buoy did its job, smaller and truer than people give it credit for. After a while, the man stood. "Thank you," he said, not specifying for what, and left. Jack stayed until the hour changed. Summer thinned the fog without curing it. The phones in town rang with new problems. He learned how to not answer all of them. He helped where his hands made sense and let the rest go to the people whose job it was now. He fixed the hinge on the shed door that had been sticking since '88 and took a quiet, honest pride in a small thing done right. There were bad days. News of a boy drowned 2 towns over. A bar fight that ended like a fall-off bad stone. A rumor about WINDWARD under new management that had him standing by the water at midnight, just in case, and laughing at himself on the way home. He let the bad days be part of the tally without letting them write it. On the anniversary of the night the flare wrote the boat's true name on fog, he and Susan walked to the end of the boardwalk and watched the harbor pretend it had never held secrets. "You all right?" she asked. "I am," he said, and surprised himself by how true it felt. "I think the water remembers, but it doesn't hold grudges." "It doesn't," she said. "People do. But people let go, too." They stood with their shoulders touching and let the town be itself around them. A gull stole a French fry. A dog barked once at nothing. A kid in a Red Sox cap asked his mother whether fog was a ghost. The mother said no. Jack wanted to say both and didn't. He went home and took the 2 letters out of the drawer, one to Hal unsent, one to Tim's mother sent, and put them back. Then took out Emily's paper and opened it at random. He read a paragraph about the economics of off-season compliance that should have been dull and wasn't. It had a sentence he loved. "Weather is not a moral, it is a condition." He closed the paper and looked out at a sky that had finally decided on a color. He visited the graveyard even though Tim wasn't there. He stood where men had their names and their dates, and he thought of all the numbers that hadn't made stones. He put his hand flat on a rock that didn't belong to anyone, and let the cool change the temperature of his skin. On the way out, he passed a funeral going in and took off his hat without thinking. The gesture made him feel like a person, not a file. He ran into Nolan's brother in the hardware store and got a look that wanted an argument and settled for looking away. He ran into Hal's son at the grocery and got a nod that wanted nothing. He didn't take either personally because he was older than his feelings now, in a way that felt like skill. He started carrying a small notebook again, out of habit more than need. He wrote things down that never needed to be in a report. Eli's laugh sounds like rope uncoiling. Susan's hand on the cup is steadier than mine. Bench at breakwater occupied by men who never meet anywhere else. Bell buoy louder in wind from northeast. The notebook filled. He bought another. He didn't call them cases. He called them days. In late August, a storm rolled through and took out power for a night. The town turned into a place he recognized from before it had pretensions. Generators coughed. Candles showed faces in ways electric light never does. He and Susan played cards by a window that admitted lightning like a guest who knew how to leave. He didn't think about boats. He thought about roofs and the way rain finds the same paths every time unless you fix the path. When the power came back, the clocks blinked 12 Gaukren kitchens up and down the street. He didn't go set anyone else's. He set his own and poured coffee and stood where he could see the harbor and not be seen by it. He felt the urge to call the station and ask after nothing in particular. He didn't. One morning in September, a postcard arrived with a picture of a shipyard crane and a sky the color of steel. On the back, a line. "Engines sleep on time now." No signature. He put it next to the photo of Emily in the cap and gown that didn't exist yet, but already did in a drawer. Years would pass. New kids would stand where he had stood and say, "We got it," and sometimes mean it and sometimes not. A new harbor master would forget a form and then learn not to, and then teach someone else. Fog would come and go without checking with any of them. Men would still try to convince themselves that weather is permission. Some would learn faster than others. Some would need paper to teach them. Jack would grow older in a house that had made room for all his versions. He and Susan would replace the rug again, and this time argue about color, and then laugh because it was never about color. Emily would send a holiday card with a photo of a kitchen table and 2 mugs and a note that said, "Still writing." Caleb would wave from a truck sometimes, and sometimes he would not, and both would be all right. Eli would die on a calm day, a hat on his chest, family around, the town telling stories that were true enough. On a walk one evening when the light made everything honest, Jack would pass the spot where the payphone used to be. There'd be a new sign about a community bulletin board and a little library box with paperbacks stacked like promises. He'd open the door and see a crime novel inside with a cover that lied beautifully. He'd close it and smile and keep walking. He would end most days the same way he'd started most, at the window, coffee cooling slow, the bell buoy tolling at a pace that matched his breath. He would think, not every time, but often enough, about the sentence he'd written on a board the day he made himself stop chasing endings he wasn't owed. Same boat, same window, different ending. And when the fog came in fast again one night, swallowing the harbor lights until Bar Harbor looked erased and redrawn in chalk, he would stand and count horn blasts, no months anymore, and feel behind his ribs not a wound, but a scar that didn't ache unless the weather changed. He would let the scar be what it was. Proof of healing, not of harm. He would turn off the kitchen light because the room knew him in the dark, and he would go sit with Susan while the town did what towns do. Slept, woke, told stories, told the truth, and the bell kept time like it always had.